Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on Ancient Greek Origin Stories. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going way back to when it all began, or at least when the Greeks thought it all began. In today's lecture, we're going to start with the primordial deities, those that came long before the Olympian gods. From there, we'll move on to the first generation of Titans, before we see the epic battle between Olympian and Titan. Finally, we'll look at the origin of men and women in ancient Greece. By the end of today's lecture, you'll be able to reconstruct the ancient Greek narrative of how their universe and their gods were created. You'll also be able to describe how Greeks thought human beings first came into the world. And finally, you'll have an understanding for the different ancient sources that Greeks wrote to create these origin stories. So, before we get into the story of how the Greeks thought it all began, let's look at the sources themselves. Our main source for this is a guy by the name of Hesiod, who was writing in the 8th century, or the 700s BC. Now, Hesiod wrote two different books. One, known as the Theogony, dealt with the origin of the gods themselves, the origin of the universe, and then the gods and the primordial deities within that universe. His second text, the Works and Days, describes the relationship between early humans and those gods. And so not only do we get the creation of all things, we get the earliest relationship between people and those divine beings. Now, in the 8th century, Greece was just coming up, right? Just starting to rise and become more complex, and Hesiod is one of our earliest authors. But when we say that he's our main author for these origin stories, that's a little bit of a misnomer. There's actually a lot we don't know about this guy. For one, we don't even know if he actually lived. Our earliest source writing about Hesiod goes only a couple hundred years after he was supposedly writing. So we don't even know if he was a real guy. Second, we don't actually know whether he put pen to paper, or stylus to papyrus in this case. Instead, we often think that rather than writing, Hesiod may have been like an oral bard, singing these songs to different groups throughout archaic Greece. So we don't know whether he was a real guy, he was a group of people, whether these were written or whether these were sung. And these exact same questions are ones being asked of the most famous of Greek authors, Homer. Now, Homer himself was a contemporary of Hesiod, so writing or singing right about the same time. And in addition to Hesiod, Homer provides us with another set of stories about the early universe and the gods within that universe. And so the same questions are asked. We don't know whether he was an actual person or maybe a name given to a group of people, whether he was writing these texts or whether he was singing to groups. And so from this, right, while they stand as our main evidence for the ancient Greek origin stories, there's still a lot that we don't know. With that being said, we do have a good kind of narrative passed down to us. And it all begins with chaos. So according to the ancient Greek origin story, before there was anything else, the very first deity was chaos. And the best way to think about this is essentially think of chaos as nothingness. Think of it as a complete void from which all other things arose. So, we start with chaos, we start with nothing, and out of nothing, we get something. We actually get quite a few different things. And so what you can see here is the first generation of beings starting with these kind of deities that are more or less kind of half person, half nature. All right? So they're personified, but they're very intimately tied to the different kind of forces of nature. And so we see Tartarus, which becomes the deep, dark abyss. We see Gaia, or Mother Earth. We have Eros, or desire, Erebus, and darkness, and Nyx, or night. And one of the interesting things we'll see here is that you'll notice that eros, or desire, is one of these first generation of beings according to the poet Hesiod. Now this is a little weird because in other Greek mythology we see eros, also known by the Roman name Cupid, as the offspring of the goddess Aphrodite and the god Mars or Ares. And so this is a little bit weird that according to one story we see him from the beginning. According to another story he's born much, much later on. And this comes to one of the takeaway points that when we talk about Greek mythology, we're talking about a vastly different set of stories that we kind of put together to come up with the best narrative possible. But in antiquity, there were many different kind of stories about these gods, and so there's no one kind of single narrative. The other takeaway point, like I mentioned, right, when we're looking at this earliest generation of Greek deities, what we're doing is we're looking at these kind of beings that are kind of half nature, half person. The other thing to remember that when we're looking at Hesiod's Theogony or the Works and Days, anything Homer has to say about the gods, while these are our best sources for kind of where the gods came from, this is very different than when we look at something like the Bible or one of the holy texts in one of the major religions today. So most people who are believers in Christianity would think that the Bible is either divinely inspired or the literal word of God or something along those lines. In antiquity, however, in Greek antiquity, when we're looking at these stories about the gods, while these concern the divine beings of ancient Greece, they aren't kind of considered to have that same holy or sacred aspect. So while people who believe in the Bible may think that that's kind of the word of God, people in ancient Greece thought the Theogony and the Works and Days were stories about the gods, but they weren't written by the gods themselves. So, back to our narrative. Remember, it all began with chaos, with nothingness. And out of that nothingness, we get the first generation of beings. And for the purposes of our story today, the most important of those beings is Gaia, or Mother Earth. And here you can see kind of a nice depiction where they're trying to capture that half nature, half person aspect of this early being. Now, Gaia gave birth to Uranus, or in Greek, Oranos. So Gaia is Mother Earth. Oranos, who we see here, would be considered Father Sky. Now, this is where Greek mythology and these origin stories start to get a little bit weird. So Gaia was able to produce Oranos, or Uranus, with no help from anybody else, all right? So a virgin birth from Gaia, producing Father Sky, and now it gets from weird to kind of creepy. She actually starts sleeping with her son at this point in time. So Gaia and Uranus hook up, and they give birth to 3 different races of early divine beings. The first and most famous are the Titans, those divinities that ruled before the Olympian gods. So there are 12 Titans, and they actually give birth to other Titans down the road, as we will see. But in the beginning, these are kind of the most personified, the most human of the different divinities that Mother Earth, or Gaia, and Father Sky, or Oranos, produce. These are the least dreadful of the beings as well, and we see that when we compare them to the next set of divinities, the Hecatoncheires, literally in Greek, meaning the 100-handers. So you can see kind of a modern depiction of what these may have looked like here. And these Hecatoncheires had 100 hands and 50 heads and simply incredible amounts of strength. And they were complemented by the third race of divine beings produced by Gaia and Oranos. And those were the Cyclopes, all right? So this is the Greek version of how we pluralize the word Cyclops. So just like Polyphemus in Homer's Odyssey. And the Cyclops, of course, just like you've heard, has the one giant eye in the middle of the head. So early on, the produce of Gaia and Oranos, there are 3 of the Cyclopes and they become wonderful craftsmen, and as we'll see, they actually produce the weapons that the Olympian gods are so well known for. Now, it turns out that Uranus was not a great father figure. In fact, he was so disgusted by these beastly creatures, the Hecatoncheires and the Cyclopes, that he bottled them up inside of Gaia, inside of Mother Earth. He basically tried to put them back into her belly. Now, Gaia was understandably upset about this, right? She went through a lot of months of giving birth to these huge beastly creatures, and now her husband and her son, weirdly enough, is trying to say that he doesn't want them around anymore. So Gaia starts plotting with the Titans, and she says, we must overthrow Uranus. You must overthrow your father. But only one of the Titans has the courage and the strength and the intelligence to be able to do this. And that's the youngest of the Titans, a guy by the name of Cronus. In Roman mythology, we'd call him Saturn. And so one night, as Uranus is drunk on wine and going to lay with Gaia, Cronus steps up with the mighty sickle that you see here, and he chops off the member of his father, Uranus. So things have gotten pretty gruesome. Uranus is now castrated. Cronus, his own son, has done the deed. And what do you do after you do that? Well, Cronus picks up the member, throws the phallus out of the heavens, across the sky, across the earth, and it lands in the Mediterranean Sea. Now, along the way, as you might imagine, it's spurting blood all over the place. And from the blood of Uranus's phallus, we get the rise of the giants, and we get the rise of the Meliae. They're these kind of tree nymphs. And where the phallus falls in the Mediterranean is right off the coast of the island of Cyprus. And there it sinks down, and the water starts frothing, and from that froth, we get the most beautiful of all Greek goddesses, Aphrodite. And that's why when you see her depicted, like you do here in Botticelli's painting, you see her arising out of the sea on a half shell, the product of the castration of Uranus. Okay, so you would think that Cronus would have learned his lesson after overthrowing his own father to treat his kids nicely. Turns out that that's not the case. So Cronus has received a prophecy from his mother Gaia. And what he learns is that he too will be overthrown by his children. Now, his strategy, rather than bottling them back up inside Mother Earth, is to start eating his children. I know, seems like a perfectly natural response, right? And so Rhea, his wife, who you see on the left here, every time she gives birth to one of their kids, Cronus just eats the child whole. You can see a rather more gruesome take by Francisco Goya over here, and then a rather cleaner version of it in the Roman sculpture on the left-hand side. So Cronus is eating all of his children, and finally Rhea, just like her mother Gaia, gets understandably upset and decides that she's got to have one of her kids live. And so the youngest of these, Zeus, is taken away, given birth to in a little cave on the island of Crete. And instead of the baby, Rhea gives to Cronus a stone wrapped in kind of swaddling clothes. Now Cronus must have been really, really hungry that day and didn't chew his food and just swallowed the stone whole, thinking that he had avoided this evil prophecy, knowing that he would be overthrown. Zeus instead, though, grows up on the island of Crete. Looks like a nice place to grow up. And has a delightful life there, growing up amongst nymphs, actually getting married to a Titaness long before Hera's ever in the picture. That's going to give birth to Athena later on. But eventually, when he's of age and when he's of strength, he starts plotting with his mother Rhea to overthrow Cronus and release and free his brothers and sisters who've been ingested by his dad. And so what they do is they have him start drinking wine, but this wine has been poisoned. Think of it as a syrup of ipecac. And so when Cronus ends up drinking the wine, he starts vomiting profusely. And out come the different Olympian gods, formed whole because, once again, he didn't chew his food. So now all of Zeus's brothers and sisters are freed, and we're setting up for an epic battle between the Olympian gods and the Titans. And we call this battle the Titanomice. And so when you see this word, think of this as a Greek version that stands for the battle between the Olympians and the Titans. Now the Titans are still kind of stronger, older, wiser, and so the Olympians need some sort of help in this battle. And so what they do is they go to their grandparents, they go to Gaia, and they go get the Hecatoncheires and they get the Cyclopes out of their prison. And they join the Olympians in their battle against the Titans. Now, the Hecatoncheires have incredible strength. They start raining boulders down upon the Titans. The Cyclopes are incredible craftsmen, and so they start crafting weapons that become the iconic weapons of the Olympian gods. So these Cyclopes, they're the ones who give Zeus his thunderbolt, and who give Poseidon his trident, and who give Hades his cap of invisibility. And after this prolonged battle, with the Hecatoncheires raining boulders upon the Titans, eventually the Olympians are able to prevail. Now the Olympians become the new ruling deities, and Zeus himself becomes the kind of new king of the gods. They proliferate amongst each other, and one of the things that you'll see is while they still have some sort of natural aspect to them, right? Poseidon, for instance, is associated with the sea. These are much more personified than what we get with the early deities and early divinities in Greek, in the kind of ancient Greek origin story. And we see these Olympian deities, the ones who now rule from Olympus, right, now start to give the Titans the bad treatment that the Titans once gave to their brothers and sisters, the Hecatoncheires and the Cyclopes. And in particular, the ruler of the Titans, the guy who led them into battle, was Atlas. And we see him, his punishment, right, having to hold the entire world and universe upon his shoulders. And you can see both in ancient Roman sculpture depicting how that might have looked, as well as a more modern kind of 20th century depiction of Atlas holding the world upon his shoulders. And so that's how we get the deities that we associate with ancient Greece, right? It starts with nothingness. We proceed to this kind of early generation of primordial beings, things like Mother Earth and Father Sky. And from there, we get the Titans and the Olympians, and eventually a huge battle ensues in which the Olympians are able to prevail. But you'll notice that we haven't talked about people at all so far. And when we start to talk about people, we have the Greeks viewing them as the creation of one of the second generation of Titans. So those Titans, Cronus and Atlas, they all had kids. And one of those kids was Prometheus, another one of the Titans, and it's his job to create people. And the way that this occurs in the ancient Greek origin story is that Prometheus molds man out of clay. And on this Roman sarcophagus here, you can actually see Prometheus on the left-hand side molding man there. And then you'll see just to the left of Prometheus, the goddess Athena with her kind of war helmet on top of her head. And she's the one who breathes life and breathes soul into the clay that Prometheus has molded. So now we've got people. But the problem with people is that they really stink, right? We're not fast, we're not strong, we don't have sharp teeth or talons. We're really pretty weak when it comes to living in the world. And so what Prometheus decides that we need to do is we need to have some sort of thing that we can control that will allow us to compete with all the different ferocious animals in the world. And so what Prometheus does is he gives us the gift of fire. Now, Zeus was never a big fan of people in the first place, and he was even a less a fan of Prometheus giving people the gift of fire. And so what Zeus does is he takes poor old Prometheus and he chains him to a mountain. And on that mountain, every day, the eagle, the kind of patron animal of Zeus, comes and eats the liver of Prometheus. He just tears it right out of his stomach, eats his liver, and then every night the liver grows back, only to be eaten once again the next day by the eagle of Zeus. And this goes on and on and on. And eventually, Heracles, the hero, right, you might know as Hercules, ends up freeing Prometheus. But all because he wanted to help people survive and live happily in the world. Now, the story of woman is a little bit different. And I'm not making this up, and I don't mean anything bad by it. We really literally have in the ancient sources that Zeus decides that woman should be created to make men miserable. All right? I'm not lying about this. It's in the texts. And so what he does is he creates, or he asks Hephaestus, who you can see over here with the hammer from his forge. He has Hephaestus create woman. And it was supposed to make men miserable, but all the gods think that this woman is just fantastic, right? They think she's perfect. They're completely enamored with her. And so every one of the gods goes and gives this woman a gift. And from those gifts, we get the name of the woman herself. We get the name Pandora. Pan in Greek meaning all, Dora meaning gifts. So this is the woman of all the gifts. And they actually give her so many gifts that they put the extra ones into a jar. And her only rule is don't open the jar. Those are the gifts for the rest of mankind. Now, even though Pandora has been treated really, really well and has received all these gifts of the gods, she, of course, cannot refuse the yearning to know what's inside the jar. And so as she opens it, all the terrible things flow into the world. Plague and pestilence and greed, all the bad things about human nature go from this jar out into the world. And that's, according to the Greeks, why we have bad things in the world today. There was one thing left in the jar, though, and that last thing was hope. And so even though there are bad things in the world, hope remains. And I don't really get this part, right? You'd think you'd want hope out of the jar, back in the world, but that's the way the Greeks tell the story. So that's how we get man and how we get woman, how we have the technology like fire to survive in the world, and how the world is not always a good place because these things have been released into it. So to wrap up today, a couple things to think about, right? Our story of Greek kind of origin stories shares some with other stories from the ancient world, right? It starts with this kind of nothingness from which we get these primordial deities. More than that, we see that people from all over the world have this necessary compulsion to try to explain where we came from, how we got here, and how we're supposed to relate to divinities in the world. We also see that Greek gods aren't morally perfect, right? So from the beginning, we get Cronus castrating his father Uranus, and then Cronus also eating his own children, only for his own children try to physically overthrow him. So that's our starting point where the Greeks come into the world, their divinities come into the world. And so thank you for listening to Ancient Greek Origin Stories.